Well, welcome everybody to this webinar where we'll be looking back at 30 years of bush heritage and looking forward to the next big milestone in 2030. My name is Matthew Taylor and I'm joining you from the northern beaches of Sydney, where I'm honoured to be on the lands of the Guy-Marieagle people. I'd like to acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional custodians of this amazing land that we all inhabit, and acknowledge the fact that they've been caring for country over many millennia. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And as is the custom with bush heritage, please feel free to introduce yourself and type a greeting in and name the country, if you know it, where you're talking from. And if you'd like to put that into the chat, that would be fantastic. Please also use the chat for any questions that you have as we go through the program today. And just to let you know, we will be recording it, so other people who aren't able to make it today can listen, and also if you want to share that with other people. So casting our mind back 30 years ago, 1991, Australia's environmental movement was still really finding its feet, and a group of people gathered around a very famous walnut tree in the Liffey Valley in northern Tasmania to talk about the future of the Australian bush. With incredible foresight, that small group realised that Australia really urgently needed a better model for land conservation. And so the seed for Bush Heritage Australia was planted. And since those humble beginnings, Bush Heritage has grown to protect an area of land that equates to about half the size of Victoria, or 1.5 Tasmanias, whichever unit you prefer. And that spans a breathtaking variety of ecosystems and habitats, from the wet tropics up in North Queensland across to the arid rangelands of South Australia and in every other state of Australia. But the story is not really that of a single organisation. Rather, it's a story of the tens of thousands of concerned individuals who've realised that more needs to be done to protect our native species and our wonderful landscapes. People who are willing to make that happen and contribute their time, energy, skills, and of course, money. Now, over the coming decades, we're going to be forced to answer some of the more complex questions of our time, like how do we feed and shelter our civilization without destroying the land on which it depends? And of course, as climate and the world changes, how are we going to protect these amazing landscapes and species from threats over which we as individuals have limited control? Finding the answers to these questions is going to involve a lot of collaboration and a lot of innovation, thinking outside that box, and being willing to try new experiences and new approaches. And of course, listening to those whose knowledge comes from over 60,000 years of very practical, hands-on experience of looking after the land we call Australia. So to kick things off this morning, we have a couple of brief videos from Bush Heritage founder Bob Brown and from our CEO, Heather Campbell, reflecting on 30 years of Bush Heritage.
I heard in 1990 that local neighbours were selling up, and I knew that meant Clearfell logging if the big woodchip company bought them. That led to devising Bush Heritage Australia as a means of getting the public to help pay for highly important environmental land and to hang on to it. And those blocks are still there. We were just a little group in a valley way down there in Tasmania. But our sights were high, our determination was great, and the public loved this idea, protecting properties where there were precious and vital habitats and ecosystems that weren't within national parks, that weren't represented elsewhere. And it is a commitment, and always has been with Bush Heritage, that the bush itself was the priority. We're there to protect it 50, 100, 1,000 years from now.
Hi, I'm Heather Campbell, the current CEO of Bush Heritage Australia, and I'm standing here on Wurundjeri country at my home on the edge of the Yarra Valley. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In the 3 years that I've been with Bush Heritage, some of the most amazing things have happened. I've had the chance to meet with and work with staff, volunteers, supporters that love our bush. It has been so great to be outside with them, finding those magical moments. Some that specifically resonate with me are in the southwest of Western Australia, being with one of our ecologists as we opened a nest box and found these baby pygmy possums. That was super cool. Also last year, when we managed to achieve Special Wildlife Reserve at Pullen Pullen in Queensland, and thus protect it forever, protect it from mining and other threats, so that we very much do have our vision being achieved of healthy country protected forever. Thank you so much for your support in the last 30 years, and I'm really looking forward to the journey to come.
Some lovely words there. And now I'd like to introduce the three colleagues who are joining me today. We'll have our President, Sue O'Connor, who's going to talk to us about our growth over the past 30 years and look to the future with some insights into our 2030 strategy and plans to deepen and double our impact by then. We've also got Kate Fitzherbert, who works in our science and conservation team, and she's one of our longest serving employees with some great stories from the last 20 years, because that's about how long she's been with us, and who's going to highlight some of the significant milestones we've achieved, and of course the science that underpins all our work, and how we're going to need to adapt to meet the future challenges. And we also have Sarah Eccles from our Aboriginal Partnerships team, who will talk to us about right way science and how working with the original custodians of the land is essential to achieving healthy country protected forever. So we've come a long way from those first few 100 hectares in the early days, and bush heritage quickly aspired to evolve into a national presence and get up to Main Island, or North Island, as the Tasmanians like to refer to the rest of Australia. And so that involved the purchase of fan palm in Queensland, Brogo and Tarcutta reserves in New South Wales, and Kojonup in WA. So Kate, can you tell us about those early conservation efforts and the species they protected and the impact that those efforts have had on these reserves?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and hello, everybody. And I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I'd just like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people, and their elders, past, present, and emerging. Look, right from the start, it was interesting that the Bush Heritage Board and the volunteers that were working around with them decided that we really needed a scientific basis on which to purchase these properties. They wanted them to be of very high conservation value. So they set up a scientific advisory committee, even in those early days, to develop a set of criteria that we would use to select the right properties. And then that scientific advisory committee was also tasked with assessing the properties that came up for consideration. But that takes a little while to get all the pieces in place. So those very early properties were really quite opportunistic. And you talked about fan palm, and fan palm came to the notice of one of the board members who was told that there was a massive subdivision going on in the Daintree, and they were cutting up 1,000 blocks of rainforest. And this particular block had a really important role as a corridor for things like endangered cassowaries. So the board decided they'd go ahead and purchase it. So that was one opportunity. And as Bob points out, that property is still there, and it's still being habitat for cassowaries, as well as a whole lot of other things. And then there was Brogo. We had an amazing donor who said, if you can find habitat for koalas, we'll pay for it. And so the team went out and they started to look for good koala habitat in New South Wales. And they found Brogo, so that was purchased. And that was not only just for koalas, but there were many, many species of birds there and other animals. And then Kojonup was another one where it was the last remaining sort of stand of Wandoo woodland in this vast area of cleared country in southwest Western Australia. And that little patch, which is, I'm trying to think how big, it was about 390 hectares, I think, has proved its worth in terms that we now have the red-tailed phascogales being reintroduced there and thriving. And then there was Friendly Beaches, and then Burren. Burren was gifted by Louise Sylvan, who later became our president. And then there was Tarcutta, and Gundaroo actually before that, which was the biggest property. That was about 590 hectares. again in a sea of cleared land in central Queensland. So each of these properties, and then Tarcutter, which was white box woodland, again in a sea of cleared land pretty much in southern New South Wales, these little remnants were wonderful pockets of remnant vegetation, which were just some of the last of their type often, and incredibly important as sinks, well, as sources of genetic material and evolution and recovery for those landscapes. And all of those properties are being managed still. They're protecting their species. They're doing their task that they were purchased for. And so that was really setting the scene for what was to come.
And Kate, that we then had a big bold purchase, didn't we, in 2001 up in Queensland, which was quite a game changer for our evolving organisation. What was the significance of that for Bush Heritage?
Oh, look, yeah, that was very significant. And that was actually the time that I joined Bush Heritage. That was a real leap of faith in some ways, because this Carnarvon was 59,000 hectares. So it was an order of magnitude bigger than anything that Bush Heritage had done before. And it was the first property that actually had a price tag of 7 figures. So that was seriously scary. But by that time, the organisation had a bit of a profile. It had a loyal group of donors attached to it. And we got one amazing donation of $1 million in one cheque, which basically enabled the board to go ahead and purchase this extraordinary property without the fear that it would bankrupt the organisation. And that property is still iconic in terms of Bush Heritage. It's huge. It's in that area in central Queensland which has suffered the most terrible land clearing. It had all the boxes ticked, and it was interesting that was the first property that was really put through that scientific advisory committee's assessment process. And just as an aside, that assessment process, building the capacity to make good choices about the land we buy, is ongoing. And the one that we're developing at the moment is really, it's a mean beast. It's extraordinary. And so that process is just part of the development of the organisation. But Carnarvon was the most beautiful property. And what was really significant about it, it was the first time that we really deeply wanted to engage with the traditional owners. And I think this was under the leadership of Philip Toyne and with Doug Human as chief executive. They had a drive to do that, to really build connections with traditional owners. So this was the first group that we worked with, the Bidjara people, and that was also setting the scene for what was to become a really important part of the way Bush Heritage did business.
Fantastic. Well, perhaps, Sarah, we can ask you to expand on that importance of actually working with the local people and what that would have meant to the Bidjara to be invited by Bush Heritage to participate in the process.
Thank you, Matt and Kate. Nora, everybody. I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming from Lutruwita, Tasmania, on Palawa country, and just want to also acknowledge the diversity and resilience of all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia and their ongoing care for country. That opportunity for Bidjara was very much about being back on country, reconnecting with country and looking after it and having an opportunity to make decisions for their own country, and to pass on knowledge across the generations. Previously, that pastoral station access had been denied, other than for a few who had been working as pastoral hands or workers on the property. And Carnarvon itself is an incredibly rich cultural landscape. Anywhere you look, there is the imprints of Bidjara ancestors and relatives. And you can see whether it be a scar tree, axe grinding groove in the springs or the rock wells, on the tops of the outcrops, there's massive big ochre pits, and all around it, the station has many sandstone rock shelters that were permanent or semi-permanent living areas of the Bidjara people in past days. And these are full of engravings and rock art, campsites, and even burials. And I can never forget our first trip out with Bidjara elders and younger family members. Whilst it was some 12 years ago, it's really etched into my memory and soul forever. We had a return to country trip, and I watched as one of the elders who had been in his 60s at that time, and I'll refer to him as Uncle B because he's sadly no longer with us. But he put his hands on one of the hand stenciled artworks in the rock shelter. And in that moment, I just saw tears stream down his face. And it was tears of sorrow, but tears of happiness, knowing he was just connecting back to his relatives. And that just meant so much for him. And, you know, to be able to look after those cultural values. And again, as time went on, have his young ones come and work and look after that property and continue to have care for it. And I think for me, that's kind of, you know, that reconnection of people to country, the continuing cultural responsibility we have to look after country is where it was really at.
Thanks, Sarah. And Kate, you mentioned Philip Toyne, our past president, and the fact that he established this new philosophical approach for the growing organisation, which saw us actually extend our gaze beyond the boundaries of the actual properties we were purchasing, and to lay a foundation for a very different future. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it was interesting at that time that with Philip as the president and with Doug Human as chief executive, they recognised that if we were really going to make an impact, we couldn't just work within the fence lines of the properties that we purchased, that we had to work much more broadly and particularly with traditional owners. So the beyond the boundaries approach, which is what they adopted, was a way of extending influence, I guess, and trying to create a conservation culture in the areas that we were working in. So they were looking to engage with pastoralists, with state agencies, particularly immediately with property neighbours, with the recognition that if we could encourage regional conservation management, we would get much better outcomes, because what happens on your neighbour's property will influence what happens on your own. And that was particularly relevant where we were controlling widespread weed infestations or feral animals, goats. Like if the goats are on your neighbour's property, they're going to be over your fence. So there was a pragmatic element to that too. To protect what was inside the fence, you needed to actually manage what was outside the fence. But it was wider than that as well. It was to try and build a sense of community around conservation and very much to engage with traditional owners.
Fantastic. And this new mindset, which strongly advocated for these greater partnerships, I guess that also opened the way to a new way of thinking of working, as we've already talked about, with the local Aboriginal group. Sarah, how has that partnership approach to traditional owners grown over the years in Bush Heritage?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew and Kate. I mean, from that first relationship with Bidjara traditional owners on their country at Carnarvon, you know, and a strong knowledge, respect and understanding that today we all are on Aboriginal lands and always have been, and that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Island people have ongoing connections and cultural responsibilities to care for country. And so I'm incredibly proud to work for an organisation that sees that at the heart space, and that healthy country protected forever is really what our ancestors have given us, and is about, you know, in the past, the current and the future role that Aboriginal people have in the conservation movement. It's always been there. And so we've seen ourselves go from that one relationship with Bidjara to working side by side, listening, learning, lots of cups of teas, lots of planning sessions, lots of just time on country, to see then the first more formal relationship and partnership with Wunnabul Gumbura people in Northwest Kimberley back in 2008 to today. We're in partnership with over 30 different Aboriginal partnerships across the nation. We've learnt so much from that, and that's both at the Bush Heritage Managed Reserves, or where we're invited to come and work with other traditional owner groups on their country, often supporting Indigenous protected areas, and, you know, sharing the resources and the support for ranger groups, but very much looking at, you know, best practice and how we have the different knowledge systems and right way approaches to working together. So value for different knowledge systems, you know, empowering our people, Aboriginal people's knowledge to come back, to have those old ways of thinking come into, you know, contemporary ways of looking after country and continuing to care, and seeing this side by side in all that we do. I mean, seeing also that in that work, from that one relationship and then Winnabulgumbra to those 30 partnerships we're in today, we are actually supporting and working alongside people to look after 11 million hectares of country, and 10 million hectares of that, country is traditional owner, completely traditional owner run and looked after. And often when we think about the numbers and how big that's been able to grow and how much we've been able to support in looking after, cultural species, massive ecosystems, both saltwater country and freshwater country as well. For me, it's really been about the story of the people, from everything from in our, roots and our birthplace with Palawa people on Urra, seeing the revival of language and culture and practice, seeing young 15-year-olds share that on country and give us a welcome to country in language, in a state and an education system and a belief where many Tasmanian Aboriginal people were told they didn't exist in the education system, and then having that shared back into the schools, the local primary school. I've been able to walk alongside and work with Nyampa Wongabong traditional owners in Western New South Wales and see our support and working side by side to have 24,000 hectares of their country back into their management, a long held dream they had to continue to care for their country, to have a safe place for cultural practices, and seeing it more recently in this last year established as a 78th Indigenous protected area, and have one of their elders turn to me and say, we would not have been able to do this and jump through all those government processes and see our people on country today without walking beside bush heritage. Through to, having time out in Western New South Wales with Budgety people on their country, and seeing them back on that country, and having the repatriation of cultural artefacts that have been collected from the property previously go back to country in a ceremony, and have the elder like Phil Yulo turn to me as well and say, this is the most important day of my life, and he has had a very rich life, and to see the multi-generations of children that he's teaching, the next foundations and people to continue to care for country, to really bring that connection back and to see those two knowledge systems of right way science working together.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a very powerful evocation of the spirit of who Bush Heritage are. Thank you. Now, just a reminder, if anybody's got any questions about what any of our panelists have mentioned, please do put them in the chat. We've got time for chat and questions at the end. It'd be nice to talk now a bit about some of that science that Sarah mentioned. And perhaps, Kate, you could talk to us a bit about our 10-year strategic science plan, which we launched in 2015. So it's still underway. And that was aimed to support young scientists and to double our capacity in the science that we undertake, and broaden the depth of our conservation programs. And so it'd be great to hear whether we're on track for our 2025 target and what's happening in that science space, because I know it underpins all the work we do.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yes, that's right. The science has always been really important, and Bush Heritage has always seen itself as a science-based organisation, which it is. And the science plan was really a recognition that we needed to get a lot more capacity in our science program. And it was basically established by Jim Radford, who was our previous science manager. And the idea was to build internal capacity in science, but also to bring in external capacity to deliver our science. And one of the key things that we did, and this was sort of subsequent to Jim, was to create almost a compendium of research questions. And these were things that the people on the ground wanted to know. They documented all of those things, and that has turned into what we now call our knowledge strategy. And it's deeply embedded into the whole planning and prioritisation process of what we do each year. But there was another element to that too, that with this huge body of research questions that needed to be answered was, well, how are we going to answer them? So we have subsequently set up an internship program, a scholarship program to bring young emerging scientists to Bush Heritage to work with them And the co-benefit of that, I guess, is that we're helping to get them on their science journey and support their efforts to move into that science field, which is wonderful. And Jim set a whole lot of goals that he wanted us to achieve by 2025. And I have to tell you, we're smashing them out of the park. Because this year, we've had over 18 placement students. We've had 9 internships. We've got, thanks to the wonderful Chris and Gina Grum, we've got 6 PhD scholarships which we're able to offer. We've set up the systems to support all that work. So the science program is really starting to build momentum. And we've got over 45 science partners, and they could be from people from CSIRO to universities. So the science program is really starting to build momentum, and we're able to not only get those questions asked by these young emerging scientists, but also our own ecologists are working on those science questions as well. And the reason to get the answers to those questions is to be able to feed that knowledge back into the plans so that we adapt, particularly as we see these changes with climate change. We can adapt the plans and be as effective and as efficient as possible in maximising the conservation impact that we can have. And there's one particular project which is just got underway, which I think is pretty extraordinary, really, and it's called the Conservation Futures Project. And one of the things that we recognised was when you're trying to do really detailed planning and you're looking at it from a national scale, all the data, the information, the mapping is all held in different jurisdictions. It's at different scales, different formats, and it's very difficult to bring it together in a cohesive way. And one critical thing is actually missing from it, and that is traditional knowledge. So all the decision making that has gone on around conservation, from policy to on-ground action, is missing that vital component. It's missing what matters and what's the knowledge of those 60,000 years of land management. So one of the key elements of this project is to bring traditional knowledge into what we're trying to develop is this comprehensive national knowledge management system, which will be available to everybody, which includes traditional knowledge. It's being led by traditional owners, and we will walk alongside them to try and build a culturally sensitive way of recognising country which is meaningful to them, and bring that into that system so that it's available to everybody. And I think that it's a huge task, but I think it's going to be critically important, and it's been supported by so many other land management agencies. They all see the lack of this, and they all see the need, and we have wonderful support from our Aboriginal leaders to see this actually happen. So I'm very excited about it, and I think that once we start to do the testing of it, which is to do regional plans with all these, with all the stakeholders, that's the traditional owners, the miners, the farmers, the state agencies, organisations like us, the people who are important to that landscape, to bring them together and try and find a consensus around what do we want this country to look like in the future? What do we want to hand on to future generations? And then to use this body of knowledge to build a plan which everybody has input into, everybody recognises it's a shared plan. It has the goals from all the different people in there, and most importantly, it actually recognises and respects Aboriginal knowledge, and the wishes of Aboriginal people are embedded into it.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. We've heard some great stories from the people working in bush heritage, but the reality is we could not have achieved the things we have in the last 3 decades without those amazing people, our supporters, donors, and the incredible number of volunteers who contribute daily to almost every aspect of the work we do. So, Sue, I'd love to hear from you in terms of, what that support looks like and just how important that is to us.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. And I think, the thing for me, just wonderful hearing both Sarah and Kate. And what really brought it to life to me was in February when I was down in the Liffey Valley and I was standing on that Liffey Reserve and hearing the sound of the wind in the tall treetops and knowing that that's only there because of the vision of those early supporters, those early people who put in their money, felt that it needed to be protected, and then the Bush Heritage staff and volunteers who have worked onwards since then to keep it protected and to keep it as beautiful as it is now. Because Bush Heritage to me is not so much an organisation as a movement. It's a movement of people who are staff, volunteers, donors, supporters, partners. It's a 40,000 strong group of people who are dedicated to the vision of healthy country protected forever. There's a really great saying that for volunteers and supporters that they give their time, their talent and or their treasure. And that's what's been happening over the last 30 years. I've just recently joined over the last couple of years Bush Heritage, and the support of the Bushies, which is that 40,000 strong group of people, is just something that's just a joy to behold. Because there's really great people, and I just want to call out a couple. Susan Bell and Peter Turnbull, who are leaving a generous gift in wills that includes their 100-acre property in the Otways, which is full of dense bushlands and a range of incredible flora and fauna. And the Otways, like so many other places in the southeastern of Australia, is really has been heavily logged and cleared. There's Annette Mackey and Rod Martin who've been supporting Bush Heritage since its inception. And I wonder whether you were part of that early Liffey group, Annette and Rod. They have contributed their time and story, and it's been featured in our recent Gift in Wills guide and our 25th anniversary of Bush Tracks. Louise Sylvan, who was mentioned before, who not only donated on a personal level, was also was a president, and her leadership and insight was greatly appreciated. So you think about people, it's about that time, that talent and treasure. Caroline and Terry Belair, who have supported Bush Heritage since 2001. They've decided to make a gift to Bush Heritage in their will. Then later in 2019, made a decision that instead of their gift, that they wanted their gift to happen during their lifetime. So they wanted to have the fun and the joy of being part of selecting the land and having that purchase. It purchased more land in the Karakara-Wedderburn region, which is one of our priority landscapes. David Rickards, who's been a long-term supporter of Bush Heritage. David has a wealth of knowledge and is seemingly connected with just about everyone who's involved in the conservation sector. He's also served as our treasurer and has been a staunch supporter of Indigenous engagement and reserve acquisition, both personally and through his foundation. Because when we talk about time and talent and treasure, it will be also people who are doing things such as fencing, bird counts, or serving on the boards, because these things are so important. And we have, I think it's over 500 active volunteers, and ranging from 50 long-term supporters who have volunteered for between 10 and 20 years, and hundreds more who've provided their time and their talent for a number of years. I'd just like to say thank you, because you're all part of this movement. And you're all part of making a difference, and all of the things that Bush Heritage has achieved, you are a part of, and you have credit for your work. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sue. That's lovely to hear some of the stories of just how hugely some of our supporters and volunteers have made a difference to us over the years. Now's the time, I think, where we can look forward and think about where we have to go next. We've made some incredible steps forward in the last 30 years. And in the last 18 months or so, the board and the executive team have been working on what's the next big challenge? Where do we need to be in the future? How are we going to deal with things like a changing climate? And how ambitious do we want to be? So I'd love to hear, Sue, I know you've been involved in crafting that 2030 strategy, and that's probably our next big milestone. It'd be great to hear some insights from you from that strategy and how we plan to deepen and double our impact over the next decade, I guess.
Okay, thank you. And it's this has been again in traditional bushy fashion. It's the board, it's the executive, it's the staff, it's volunteers and supporters who have all contributed to this. The vision of healthy country protected forever is there and is staying there, because that is just so important. And even more important now when you have a look at some of the emerging trends that we've got, which is around the big impact of climate change, changes in land use, feral and invasive species threats, and the need to recognise and deepen our relationship with the traditional owners and the First Peoples. So where we have landed is that we are looking to deepen and double our impact. And this is ambitious, but it is building on the strength and the capacity and the achievements that we've had in the past. So it's not a giant leap forward, but we just know that we need to do more. So it's supported by 3 pillars. Those 3 pillars are the land acquisition, so to continue to increase the land acquisition and in our priority landscapes, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. The second pillar, and it's a bit like a 3-legged stool, and one leg is slightly thinner than the other 2. The second one is around our Aboriginal partnerships, and it's deepening those healthy country plans. It's deepening and maturing what a partnership with our Aboriginal partners looks like. And thirdly, it's the emerging area in the agricultural sector, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on, because that's an important area that we need to sort of face into. Those are supported by 3 things. We need to understand what our impact is. So a lot more work going on about impact measurement. Secondly, it's about being innovative, because as you get bigger, you need to think, and the needs become greater. You've got to think of different ways of doing things. And some of the changes that are happening in technologies and satellites and so on will enable us to do that, because we are very dedicated to delivering landscape at scale. And thirdly, there is the priority landscapes. So the work of the Science and Conservation team has worked really hard to look all across Australia to say which are the landscapes, and to assess it on what is the impact of climate change, how much protection is in those areas, and thirdly, what are the conservation potentials or risks that are in those areas. So we've now, as you can see there, we've identified our 17 priority landscapes. Some of those will be very big, which are resilient landscapes, where we will be looking to acquire land or work with the traditional owners and assist them in their land native title in those areas. It's about connecting landscapes where you have pockets, particularly in southeastern Australia and in Tasmania, so that you can get linkages, so you can get reconnection into those landscapes. And finally, it's about strengthening landscapes, particularly where it's something that is really important but may be under threat because of climate change. So between maintaining our vision, looking to deepen and double our impact, 3 priority areas supported by priority landscapes, innovation and impact measurement, we believe that we really will make a difference.
Thanks, Sue. And you mentioned the emerging focus area of partnering with agriculture. And I know that's something that isn't new to us, but that we recognise is incredibly important. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that might look?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Yeah, so, and again, this is just an example of, we're not going into the agricultural sector as a new area, but we're again looking to deepen our impact. And farming is a key use of the Australian land, and it accounts for over 50% of the country. So if we're really wanting to make that impact on biodiversity and conservation, we've got to work out the ways to work with our agricultural partners, particularly in those landscapes where it is a mosaic of national parks, bush heritage, farming and so on. So we want to work with two groups. One is modern progressive farmers who understand the role that biodiversity can play both on their farm and beyond their farm gate. And with Aboriginal groups who want to develop culturally appropriate commercial agriculture. So we're already doing work in this area. And so things such as facilitating action to protect the Murrumbidgee River, such as fencing out stock and so on, providing tools for farmers in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania to account for and protect natural capital. And this is becoming increasingly important with some of the international moves about that investors are asking for, that you can both account for your climate change and carbon, but also account for what you're doing to biodiversity. And thirdly, it's about supporting ways of using the natural capital to build that practical drought resilience. And then with the with the Aboriginal groups, it's to see culturally important plants and resources grown commercially in a way that heals country and provides economic benefits to our Aboriginal partners in those areas. Combined with our other work, this gives us the opportunity to further our objective of working at landscape scale.
Fantastic, thanks, Sue. That's great to hear. And so I think this might be a good point to see if we have any questions, because we've heard some great stories today. There is a question that's come from Catherine, which I think probably needs to go to you, Kate, in the first instance, which is asking about state government departments. And I guess that question is deliberately framed as state rather than federal. But are state government departments and their science units involved in our knowledge strategy and how we're planning our conservation futures? And if so, how?
Well, thanks for the question, Catherine. I'll take the state government agency bit first with the knowledge strategy. Not really, not at this point. So most of the people who we're engaging with on the knowledge strategy are university research organisations. So we have 45 university partners that have students who are interested in some of the work that we're doing, and want to come to bush heritage properties to undertake that research. But we haven't really truly engaged with the state agencies on that knowledge strategy at this point. That's not to say that down the future we won't, and that the information that we learn through those research projects with, say, universities won't be fed back into the state government agency sort of knowledge, what do you call it, you know, the body of knowledge that they will use. Conservation futures is different. And yes, the state agencies are involved with the conservation futures. I think we have support from, I think it's Victoria, I'm not sure I'm going to get this right, New South Wales, Victoria and
South Australia.
South Australia, thanks Matt, who are involved with some of our they are partners in that Conservation Futures program, and we're sort of hoping that over time, as the project is successful, that we can demonstrate the value of it, that other state agencies will get involved and be able to be part of that whole project.
Thanks, Kate. And there's a question I wanted to ask Sarah as well, which is, we touched upon the agricultural sector and increasing our the clever ways we can work with that sector. That's going to be equally important with traditional owner groups, isn't it? And finding ways to partner with them. Is that something you could give us a bit more on?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Yeah, definitely. Look, I won't probably totally identify who it is because it's early days, but we're working with a traditional owner group that is very much looking at cultural plants and resources and getting these back into country in commercial quantities to both heal pretty fragmented and sick landscapes, but to then see both things like, you know, kangaroo grass or grass seeds back into the market for restoration purposes, but also into the bush tucker industry, and, you know, seeing much more regular access to bush foods on everybody's plates, and also things like culturally important resources that might be used for weaving. And so a real mix of, you know, how some of those old ways of knowledge can come into contemporary agricultural practices to heal country, but to give groups an economic stronghold as well, to be able to continue to put money back into their ranger groups or their caring for country groups to continue that work.
Yes, fantastic. Okay, well, last chance for any of our wonderful participants to chuck a question into the group chat there, if you've got anything you'd like to ask the panelists. While you're thinking on that, perhaps I can ask a final question for everybody, which is always the thing I like best, which is finding out what really excites you about our 2030 strategy and that ambition. So, Kate, perhaps I can ask you first. What's the thing you're looking forward to us achieving in 2030, by 2030?
Oh gosh, a whole heap, Matt. Look, I'm sort of an eternal optimist. So by 2030, I reckon that bush heritage will be, will have achieved the acquisition goal. I reckon we're going to expand the footprint, which I think is incredibly exciting. I think that we will be a major player in the conservation science field. I think we're going to be a real leader, not only with government, but with other NGOs. I just think there's so much energy, there's so much drive, there's so much passion in this organisation that there's almost nothing we can't achieve. So I'm really optimistic about the future. I mean, climate change, I reckon we will have finally got, the science believes we will finally have the whole planet really working very hard to bring back down those carbon levels. So I'm sort of optimistic from that perspective as well. I think we've got a hard road to travel, but I think there's huge opportunity, and you know, we're an amazingly adaptable mob, and I think when the pressure's on, we've proved through COVID, we step up, we can really do stuff. So despite all the barriers that seem to be in the way at the moment, I'm really optimistic that we'll achieve the goals, and that this is the decades of environment, I reckon, over the next 10 years, 20 years.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kate. And I'm seeing that some questions coming thick and fast now as we've got towards the end. So, Sue, if I could ask for your sort of what you're most excited about, but also if I can throw in a really good question, which is something I'm sure you've been thinking about in your role as president, which is how big can bush heritage grow without the danger of becoming unwieldy and losing oversight of knowledge of what's happening in detail on the ground with properties and projects, which I think is a fantastic question. So are you on mute?
That's right. I'm just wondering, you would think after 18 months, I'd know exactly where the unmute button was. So thanks for the question. So the thing for me that by 2030 is it goes from the micro and the macro. And the macro is that in those priority landscapes, we are known and respected for the work that we are doing for biodiversity, keeping the country healthy together, that we are working with our partners, both as lead, working beside or supporting, whichever it is the most appropriate. So that in those areas, we have that the biodiversity, at the very least, is the same, and in most cases I would hope that it is better than it is today, that our impact has been so strong and working with others that it is better for us being there. So it's a fairly simple to say, and it's going to take a whole lot of really hard work from all of us. On the question about how do we make sure that we don't become unwieldy, and it's a really good question, and it's something that we need to keep on thinking about, is as you start to expand, you need to change how it is that you operate. So when Bush Heritage was a small group that was just in Hobart, it had a certain way of operating. Then when it started to move over onto the North Island, it had to change again. And then when we started to have the big purchases at Carnarvon, we had to change again. So you'll see, we've just started to take the first steps on how the organisation is structured. You've no doubt seen there's been a lot of ads for staff, so we're increasing the staff. But you've got to think about who is it that's working for you? How is it that you are working? Because it doesn't matter if you've got this really big vision, if you haven't worked out how it's happening on that property, in that part of that property, in that landscape, you won't achieve what it is that you want to achieve. But it's something that we continue to pay attention to. And it would be easy to lose that, but we really need to be conscious of it. And also, we are a movement. How do we make sure that we continue to be a movement?
Fantastic. Thanks, Sue. Now, Sarah, I'm going to come back to you to finish up with, if I may, on what's exciting you most. But there's one last question I think we can get in the time we've got, which is a really useful one, which is, do we measure and monitor any of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and their KPIs, and also the Closing the Gap KPIs as they relate to Bush Heritage's work? And I guess, Kate, you can probably help us with that one.
Yes, I'm not the ideal person to help you, but the answer is a simple yes, we do. We measure our progress against a whole range of different benchmarks, and the sustainable goals, biodiversity goals are certainly some of them, yes.
And we actually mention them in our annual report, which we call our impact report, don't we? So it's something we're very conscious of on our role on the global stage from what we contribute to in Australia. I'll answer one final question that's come about volunteers plans before going to Sarah to take us out. And that was a question from Jane about accommodating grey nomads touring Australia and visiting Bush Heritage Reserves to volunteer. Now, my hair doesn't look that grey, but I can assure you it is. And my plan for my downshift is to continue working for Bush Heritage and tour Australia when I can, and do exactly what Jane's just described there. So let me answer that for you, Jane, and others on the call, and for myself, which is we have a fantastic volunteer program. There's a couple of wonderful ladies who run that, and it's very highly regarded in the industry, and we're considered to be really the best at it. There's always the challenge that some of our reserves are very remote and aren't well set up for general visitors, but we do always need volunteers to help with work. So there's a very comprehensive program, and we can get in touch with you, Jane, and put you in touch with those people for whatever grand plans you have. And I'm sure they'll be very exciting when you can actually move interstate and do that. So with that, if there's any other questions we haven't got to, we'll follow up with those people individually and attempt to give you a comprehensive answer. But thank you otherwise. Sarah, perhaps you can finish us off with what's your excitement and thing that you're most looking forward to us achieving by 2030.
Thanks, Matt. I mean, for the deepening, it's really to see greater access for our Aboriginal mob, that knowledge base that's always been there, and that continual cultural responsibility to care for country is central to decision making around country, and continuing that, to see the next generations come through strong, proud, that foundation of who we all are as a nation, that strong cultural roots underneath us is all part of our culture and our identity in Australia, and to really see that what we say in our language, calling what an hour, that walking together is strong, and respect for each other, and that continues into the future. And that is really the practical reconciliation on the ground in a meaningful way for people's livelihoods, that we will see this flourish. And, greater Aboriginal employment and greater just respect of walking together to see country in a very holistic way, and bring that spirit and cultural aspects of country back in, and the understanding that we can have together. I think it's a huge journey we have to make sure that the old ways are respected in today's ways and continue on.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'd like to thank our panelists today, Kate, Sue and Sarah, for giving us a wonderful insight and some great stories about Bush Heritage, past, present and future. But most of all, I'd like to raise a toast, albeit only water at this time of the morning, to you, our wonderful supporters who've joined us today and who continue to contribute, using Sue's phrase, time, talent and treasure, to the support of what is a fantastic movement and a fantastic organisation. And if any of you'd like to stick around, we've got a few minutes at the end where we've got some, I guess, congratulatory messages from some of our past CEOs and presidents who've recorded a little piece to camera. So thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and look forward to our continuing work to make sure we have healthy country protected forever. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to acknowledge Bush Heritage turning 30 and all those people that have contributed from when Bush Heritage first started through all its iterations and progressions over the last 30 years to where Bush Heritage is today. And I'm really pleased and thrilled to be able to acknowledge that and congratulate everybody that's been on the journey.
So it gives me great delight to congratulate Bush Heritage on 30 years of being a good news story in conservation and making a real impact, funded largely by private organisations and donors who believed in the mission statement and have seen Bush Heritage execute that over 11 million hectares over 30 years. Congratulations and very best of luck for the future.
So congratulations on the 30 years. It's just outstanding. It has been a great pleasure to serve on the board for the wonderful staff of Bush Heritage, the terrific volunteers. It really was an honour to be able to help this organisation succeed in the wonderful way that it has.
Past CEOs, leaders, all of you, past staff, volunteers, what an amazing collection of people and what achievements. Congratulations to everybody. It is an organisation and your achievements that gives me huge hope for the future. And I can still feel it, where we sat, how it felt when we made the decision to buy Carnarvon Station, our first really big property. On paper, it looked a risk. We didn't have the money, but I knew we had a year of good research, very good people looking at it, sussing out all the different risks and how we would meet them. And so I think that's probably a very important standout moment for me. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
And I want to congratulate the Bush Heritage team and all their supporters right around Australia for the outstanding achievement of 30 years of continuous conservation effort right across the country. In my time, I was very proud of my efforts and the team's efforts and all our supporters' work to expand our partnership with Aboriginal people across Australia, but also to add to that permanently reserved estate in places like Hamlin Station and Pullen Reserve in Queensland, among many others. So well done, Bush Heritage. Have a great day and congratulations to everyone. Cheers for now.
Hello all you wonderful Bush Heritage people. My name's Judy Henderson and I'm talking to you from Goonbangir country in northern New South Wales, where I was born, but 30 years ago I was in Tasmania and had the absolute privilege of being there right at the very beginning of the Bush Heritage story. Who would have thought that 30 years later Bush Heritage would be a major force for the environment and for connectivity conservation in Australia? That's all due to the wonderful effort of so many people, so congratulations.